Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the IDC European Futurescape live broadcast. My name is Thomas Meyer. I'm the Group Vice President for IDC's research in Europe. And I'm joined here today by Phil Carter, who's the Chief Analyst in the region. And I think it's fair to say it's been an interesting journey, and we're seeing the fruits now of all that work.
Thank you, Tom, and a warm welcome from my side. Thank you very much to all of you for dialing into this session. I'm looking forward to a very interactive and engaging discussion.
So I guess that's a key aspect here as well. So it's not just been you or me, for that matter, but it's been a whole team that's been behind bringing all of this together. And what we're seeing today is really the culmination of various weeks of work with a large team behind us.
Exactly. I mean, this is no mean feat, right? So to bring together the 10 key predictions that we think are going to shape the market over the next 12 to 36 months, it takes a lot of work. And so the team that you can see on this slide really reflects a lot of that work, and a number of them will be on the Q&A session that we'll have as part of the follow-up to the presentation.
So we'll be interactive throughout the session?
That's the idea. That's the idea. We'll take questions as we go along in the poll that you can see in the console in front of you, but also on Twitter. So we've moved into the social media age, and so there is a tweet jam happening. Please follow us on IDC Futurescape. One of our social media expert analysts, Francisco Geronimo, is going to be leading that, and you can pop in questions into the social media environment there, and also follow the conversation, contribute to the conversation as well.
Well, that's great. So my task here is today to moderate us through this a little bit, and also keep an eye on Twitter, see what's coming through, as well as the chat windows as well. So we're looking forward to your questions coming in. Please keep them coming. If you can't deal with them while we're in the next hour, we'll make sure we'll follow up over the next couple of days. So please do post your questions, post your comments, agree and disagree with us as we go through the predictions. But perhaps as a starting point, I think it's always good maybe to look back a little bit. So could we look at the 2017 predictions and just give us a feel for where we are at this point regarding last year's?
Well, we did brilliantly, as expected, in terms of our last year's predictions. Now, so obviously today we're going to be looking to the future. We're going to be looking to the next 12 to 36 months, and we're going to identify the key trends that we think are shaping the European market in that time frame. But let's look back over the last 12 months and look at the predictions we put in place a year ago and see how we did. And not too bad, as you can see from the scorecard here, Tom. There were a couple of areas which maybe didn't move as quickly as we expected. One was this notion of augmented humanity that we talked about last year. Some examples in some areas, but maybe not as quickly as expected. The other one, which we'll talk about more in today's discussion, is this notion of industry cloud platforms, where we saw some examples building up a little scale, like MindSphere from Siemens, Klöckner with their logistics platform as well, but not as many as we were expecting. So I think we'll pick up that discussion during the course of today's predictions.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So when we look at the scorecard, this is a traffic light system, so 8 green, 2 yellow, so that's not too bad. So that's entirely down to you as the chief analyst and the team behind you, right?
I think the team more so.
That's good to see. It's good to see. And as you said, we'll pick up the industry cloud platforms in a little while, but perhaps to start stepping into what's shaping our thinking as an organization, there are some key events that happened last year. I think that we're all focused on, both personally as well as professionally, and perhaps you can describe some of those that shaped our thinking.
Absolutely. So here's an overview of some of the crucial events that happened in Europe over the last 12 months. And clearly, Brexit is looming large in the background, and we'll talk a bit about that. But there were some other risk factors, so the French and German elections, which we've seemed to have come through, the Catalonia crisis as well. I think generally the way that the economists are forecasting is that we will be heading towards about a 2% growth in 2018, which reflects a pretty stable 12 months, considering the risk factors. Now, Brexit is still looming large moving forward, even though we have seen some of the initial parameters for the negotiations agreed as of last week, which was an important milestone. But there's still some way to go. And we've just actually published a report.
Right, that's what I was going to refer to. Because I guess the team's been quite busy reacting to where we are on the Brexit journey in Europe and what it means to the economies overall.
Exactly. So, I mean, the idea is to look at the IT impact. So a number of the key analysts in the team have put this together, again, over the last few weeks, building up to this session. And it is available for download for everyone on this webcast. And just to give you a sense of some of the key findings from that, this chart actually shows two views. The blue bubbles are basically our view of key countries post-Brexit, so as of today. The orange bubbles are pre-Brexit, right? So previously. And so at an average level, we're expecting 2.3% growth for the region, not bad from an IT standpoint, for 2018. I think obviously the key bubble that we look at in the context of Brexit is the UK. Right. So if you look at pre-Brexit, they were leading the charge, so the fastest growing market actually in terms of from a European standpoint. But post-Brexit, fallen back a bit, so at about 2% growth, so behind the average. But still not too bad, right? So if you think about it in the context of some of the drama that was highlighted at the time of when Brexit was announced, it's some level of stability there, even though the UK market is expected to see a slight downward trend in terms of the growth.
Okay, so that's quite interesting. So what we're expecting is effectively a period of stability somewhat. We've also updated our forecast slightly, so it's a reasonably stable environment that we're in. So when we then hone down perhaps on some of the tech events that happened, and I'm saying tech because it's not just the tech industry anymore, the IT industry as we understand it, but we're seeing other aspects of this now playing a role in our thinking.
Exactly. So, if you look at some of the CEO departures, not so much IT departures, but these are industry CEO departures that happened this year, and we'll come back to that. But in the core IT space, you look at it, I think infrastructure, feeling a bit of pain, and so you see some of the restructuring and merger and acquisition activity with HP and Dell EMC starting to hit the market now. Software and services, not so much big mergers and acquisitions this last year. I think more bite-sized acquisitions. So, for example, VMware with Wavefront, SAP with Gigya, Red Hat with CodeNV, smaller acquisitions filling out gaps in the portfolio, and trying to ensure relevance with the changing market dynamics. But I think the CEO departures, so the departure of Mark Fields and Jeff Immelt, leaving Ford and GE respectively, were important milestones in the year, we think, because those two individuals were pioneers, digital pioneers, as we see it, for their organizations, trying to lead them on quite an aggressive digital transformation journey. And unfortunately, they left the organizations.
Right. So we're obviously looking at the futurescapes at becoming digitally native, or the digital native. So you're referring to these CEOs that have been pioneers or were pioneers and understood. So a lot has been discussed about why they might have left. But can you give us just a snapshot from our perspective why this is pertinent to our discussion here today?
Sure. So, I mean, first and foremost, I think it's important to understand that they made some initial investments for their respective organizations. And although there were some results, they weren't as big or as large as they expected, and the investor patience ran out. Right. So, and that's the backdrop for that. Now, in Europe, we have a number of what we will call digital pioneers at the CEO level as well. And these reflect some of them. So they're not necessarily just European, they run global companies, but they're across 9 different industries. And these are standout CEOs who are leading their organizations on this digital transformation journey. And they will be looking at those departures quite closely because the scrutiny is on them now, because they have started similar type of initiatives. And they're going to have to deliver. They're going to have to execute, and they're going to have to deliver the revenue streams that they're talking about to keep their investors off their backs in terms of the overall company expectations.
And usually, I guess what's fair to say, it's not one initiative that they are being judged by, but it's moving in often very big tankers. And so it would be probably good to get a sense of what these CEOs are now looking at in terms of driving the organization forward.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot being talked about in terms of business model transformation in the context of digital. And we've identified 5 different business models with examples that we see these types of CEOs looking at as they shift the thinking. And we call this, at a high level, the future of commerce, because this is a new way of selling, a new way of marketing, a new way of going to market. And these cut across data monetization, platform-based revenue models, contextual offerings, a variety of different capabilities. And you can start to see some changes in terms of those companies and how they go to market. And for Europe, I think this is an interesting trend to watch, because we think that there is an opportunity now for some of these companies to start to merge and potentially acquire across industries. So one of the expectations that we have is that over the next 5 years, you will start to see maybe 1 or 2 of these large organizations, potentially a Siemens and a BMW, coming more closely together to target transportation from a cross-industry standpoint, to build up some of the scale and target new opportunities linked to that, not synergies from a traditional merger and acquisition type of activity that we would have seen in the past.
So this goes potentially towards mega collaborations or mega mergers and acquisitions, in fact.
As they become tech companies, right? So that's the thinking, is that they will need to build scale in certain areas as they themselves become technology companies on this journey to the digital native enterprise.
So we're going to focus a little bit on personas throughout this. So do you want to talk a little bit perhaps about one example that you've brought along more specifically around some of the changing trends that we're seeing that the CEOs are focusing on?
Well, a big focus now is how do you measure this? Right? So because if you look at the traditional way of measuring performance, it was income statement, balance sheet, and the traditional line items within that. Now, in the digital world, it's going to be about new things. So if you look at the Siemens example here, Net Promoter Score for a B2B company, looking at customer advocacy or employee participation or employee engagement, best place to work. But increasingly, we're also going to see this focus on data value. So what is the value of the data? How do you value the data in your organization if you want to monetize it? Because as it moves around the ecosystem and you take this outside-in approach to running the business, you're going to have to think about the value of the data that you contribute but also consume in that ecosystem.
Okay. So that's quite a good case. And in fact, the CEO departures, I guess, point to the fact already that this isn't quite so easy. And in fact, at the CIO summit that we had in September, the feedback that we got as well, look, we're getting to a point, we're changing some of the things around skills, talent, KPIs, but a lot of the companies find themselves at a point where they find they're getting maybe stuck, or they're beginning to struggle with building the scale. So is that what we're seeing generally as well?
Yeah, so that reflects some of our latest research on maturity, right, that we rolled out at the CIO Summit in Spain of September this year, and which show that 55% of organizations are stuck on between stages 2 and 3. And that's really, that step, getting on stage 3 is a big one, because it's about scale. How do you get scale beyond digital initiatives, rolling up around the edges and embedding those in traditional business units? Because that takes that's what it takes to actually deliver the revenue at the end of the day. But the journey is there, right? So they need to move along quickly. If you think about the endpoint, which is the overarching theme for this webcast, which is the digital native enterprise, we are predicting that by 2027, 3/4 of European organizations will be at that stage. They will be digitally transformed. If they're not, they're unlikely to be in business. Right? That's the reality. But there are some milestones along that journey. If today 55% are stuck, we're going to expect that 60% put in new leadership structures, that they start to think about new ways of monetizing data, but also put KPIs in place for innovation realization in terms of new revenue streams from digital services and offerings.
So the next 3 years are somewhat critical, if you look at this in terms of the timeline and in terms of the investments, and I guess some of the big bets that these CEOs are making in terms of transforming the companies as well. Now, if you bring this down to, we've talked about some of the barriers and challenges. So if you now look at what we're suggesting as a framework in terms of looking at this, can you maybe expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, so we've identified 5 key, what we call accelerated pathways to digital transformation. So getting these organizations moving more quickly on this journey towards the digital native enterprise. And we've outlined them here. It's about performance, so redefining these KPIs, focusing on digital KPIs, because this new digital native enterprise is going to have to look at technology and data completely differently. It has to be the lifeblood. They have to scale operations and innovation in orders of magnitude better than others in their industries, and then also be focused on customer and ecosystem in an outside-in type of fashion. So the KPIs around that have to change. The organizational structures need to change in terms of embedding in the business, the new roadmaps that need to be put in place, aligning the stakeholders, the capabilities, shaping the technology expertise, but increasingly the technology architecture, which we'll talk about. But just before we get into that, I would say that these 5 pathways are the basis for a number of initiatives coming up from IDC over the next few months. So we've got our digital transformation Futurescape, which Jan van Wanno, Mariana Kolding, and Danielle Hernandez are running in January, which will go into the details of these 5 areas and go through it in more detail. It'll also be part of our digital summit in Malaga in June. And so it'll feed into a lot of the content feeding into the research in parallel.
Okay, so that's great. So I guess it's worthwhile pointing out as well. So we do have a lot more available for download following this session, and there's obviously a lot more insight coming up over the next few months as well as similar webinars to this that will expand on some of these aspects that we're looking at. But perhaps it's taking a while to get there now, but now we're sort of getting down into the nuts and bolts, and in terms of Futurescapes and our main predictions. And what we're going to do is centering this a lot around the digital platform.
Yeah, because we think this is an important time to re-look at the architectures to support digital transformation initiatives.
Again, something that came out of the CIO Summit, right?
Exactly.
Very strongly.
So it's clear that the underlying legacy systems are holding organizations back, right? So that the migration of those legacy systems is taking time. So we think this is our first prediction. Let's have a drum roll. Number one. That the number of European companies that will have deployed a digital platform will have doubled to 50% by the end of next year. So current survey data, our current survey data shows that it's about just over 20% that have currently put in place this strategy. It's just a strategy. Implementation takes a bit longer. And we expect that to double because they have to accelerate this. Now, shall I give the background?
I think it would be good.
So the background here is that a lot of organizations over the last 3 to 4 years, with their digital experimentation that they've been doing, have spun up these islands of innovation around the edges. It could be a mobile app, it could be an IoT use case, it could be a big data cluster of Hadoop in the cloud. And those have been useful and delivered some business value. They've been driven by the business in a lot of situations. And you could call them speedboats, going off from the tanker, or that tanker that we talked about, that big organization, because that big organization that sits as a tanker doesn't move that fast, right? So you need those speedboats. But when it came to integrating them and to each other or back to the enterprise IT platform, there were some challenges. And this kind of comes back to an element of being stuck on the journey, because this contributes to it. And so stage 2 was, okay, let's separate these two worlds out a bit. Let's consolidate these digital initiatives into a digital platform, but a sidecar model where you would start to try and integrate and move data back and forth with your traditional enterprise IT platform. And this is something that we saw as a stepping stone. It's a stepping stone on the process. It's an important stepping stone. But it's not the end game, because you can't have these two worlds, slow speed and fast speed IT, happening over time, because you have different organizational structures, different technology environments, but also technology debt, which continues to be built up on the enterprise IT platform. So this is why we think you need to move to stage 3. And we probably need another drum roll here, because this is the launch of our new digital platform conceptual model, which is this integrated model, which is where there's an infinity loop, so it's more conceptual in nature, but enterprise IT evolves as quickly as possible to what we call this intelligent core, which is defined by the AI, machine learning, and some of the advanced analytics capabilities that drive the business processes, both internal and external, and recreate those in a dynamic fashion based on the data pipelines coming in from all sorts of devices and elements internally, from the internal processes, but also externally. And that's where the focus is going to be. This is going to be an externally oriented type of platform, because of the fact that to be a digital native enterprise, you're going to have to be evolving as quickly as you can, linked to the dynamics of the external ecosystem.
So that's quite interesting. So maybe what would be good to help identify how this is being executed or implemented on or thought about, because I think this is what we also saw at the CIO Summit, as well as the Digital Summit. It's not easy getting your head around a framework and then turning this into practice.
Yeah, and on that point, it doesn't, the traditional enterprise architecture, governance, those type of services don't go away. They sit underneath this, but at a high level, you need to think about a different conceptual model for the digital native enterprise. And here's a good example. This gentleman, I'm not sure if you recognize him, Tom, Chema Alonso, is actually the Chief Data Officer for Telefonica. And he's helped to drive this agenda because he's seeing the data-driven nature of Telefonica as being critical to their longer-term success. Right? So this is why this notion of a data-driven platform is so important for organizations like Telefonica, but increasingly the broader market as well. And they've gone through this journey along the same lines, where they've built up these islands of innovation, integrated the silos, set up the digital platform, but increasingly they're putting a lot of investment in this notion of Aura, which is their cognitive platform, which reflects very closely back to that digital platform conceptual model that we just highlighted.
And you'll bring Chema back, in fact, as an example a little bit later on. Yeah. But I guess going back to the starting point, we talked a lot about the CEO community. And I guess at this particular point, in terms of directing the business going forward, this is probably where we see most of the implications now for that role.
Exactly. And what we're going to do for each of these predictions is to try and direct them to the most relevant persona in the organization that needs to take ownership of this theme. And for the digital platform, as the overarching theme for the predictions, as you're right, Tom, this is the CEO remit, because the digital platform is not a technology architecture for IT. It's more of a business architecture to deliver on some of those challenges that we highlighted earlier. And so this needs to be taken on by the CEO and driven across IT, business, and the digital groups in a way that you create a cross-team or cross-functional approach where they are brought to the table and deliver on the outcomes that are expected.
Right. And we probably come back to that as well, in terms of our prediction previously, where we said that a lot of the CEO community increasingly is going to be technology savvy or have a technology background. Right?
Exactly, and we've seen some good examples of that. And a couple of them were on that CEO chart. So Casper Rorsted is an example, who's at Adidas now and previously CIO of Henkel.
All right, so that's great. So that's really the core. That's the main prediction here. And there are 3 episodes that sort of center around particularly the infinity loop. So the digital native enterprise, that framework, and how this will come together. This is really the starting point. So let's have a look at the first episode, perhaps, and I'll let you look at that in a second and describe that a little bit more. But perhaps just to set this up to the first point there as well. So when we talked about cloud as a delivery model, I think that's mainly accepted now, whether it's private, public, etc., in all those different guises, that we see this coming towards us to enable that digital native enterprise. It's not the be-all and end-all, and I think you've got some stats around that as well. So maybe I'll let you actually carry on and talk to us a little bit about that first episode.
Yeah, so let's talk about the first episode of this journey to the digital native enterprise, right? And this is where we look at that broader conceptual model across the intelligent core and the edges and what's driving that. And I think, as you said, the first thing is that this is a cloud, and it's a compliant cloud. So hopefully that gives everyone... not just a cloud, but it's a compliant cloud. We'll come back to that in a second. And leads into the second prediction, which is that by 2021, you will see spending in Europe on cloud going to steadily over $100 billion. Now, there's 2 angles to this, right? One is you're using cloud as a migration delivery model for the enterprise IT platform to that intelligent core. And that's a modernization story, which is important. The other one is an innovation story around the edges where these use cases have to be spun up in the cloud because speed is the name of the game and the business outcomes associated with that are dependent on that speed. Right. So those are the two angles. Now, what I would say is there's an equation that we need to understand. So this chart gives you a sense of that 100 billion and how it plays out across the different areas. But in terms of overall enterprise IT spend, by 2021, we're looking at about 300 billion, right? So if you look at the equation, it's about 200 in traditional space, 100 in the cloud, and of that, maybe over 50%, 50 billion in public cloud. So there's still a lot of this legacy capabilities that need to be migrated quite quickly to the cloud. And this is going to take some time. We have to understand that there will be some time associated with this. But if you spin this out to the 2027 timeframe that we talked about, the ratios in that 100 plus 200 equals 300 change quite dramatically. And the point here, with the growth rates of the public cloud, which is 20 to 30% in Europe, it's where the scale is going to come in that sort of time frame. So organizations really have to buy into this. And part of that shift from the hybrid cloud window closing to the move to public cloud is the investment in multi-cloud. But because of the nature of the way multi-cloud is currently being put in place, in a lot of cases it's multi-cloud by accident. And so as a result of that, even though we say 90% of European organizations will be using multi-cloud, in 2020, only 1/3 will be governing that in a way that we would expect for workload orchestration, data portability, these sorts of things that are expected in a multi-cloud environment. And a good example, just to build this out, is Osram, as a company that we know well here in Munich. They make lights, right? And what they did is when they spun out their organization last year, what they moved is 320 production applications to the cloud, so 100% cloud, cloud only. So they made that modernization shift quite quickly. But on the innovation front, they acquired a company called Digital Lumen, which is part of their cloud-based IoT story, which is the new business model that they're focusing on. But the point is that you can now create a much better integrated model based on the fact that you've moved that 320 production applications to the cloud in that type of time frame.
So speed and agility are key factors there. And I guess one of the other things that stands out there is probably they wouldn't call themselves a light company anymore. It's probably an illumination experience company.
That's right. The new experience linked to it. Yeah.
So what does this mean to the CIO?
Well, so cloud for us is a CIO story because it is critical for the CIO to take ownership of the cloud strategy. It's about making sure the workloads run in that hybrid environment, and moving towards public cloud where it makes sense, and why, and ask the question, why shouldn't this run in the public cloud, taking into account that you need the right people, the architects in place, but increasingly, which is going to lead into the next discussion point, is it governed and secure? Is it going to be done in a way that we're going to be compliant with certain regulations that are coming through?
Well, so that's interesting, right? So we had a CISO summit not so long ago in Dublin and Ireland, and security, compliance, all of these factors played a big role in the discussions there, clearly. We had a large part of the CISO community there. So interestingly enough, so when I'm a CIO, I look at the different delivery models. I might be working with a cloud service provider. I might be looking at some of them. I might be a cloud service provider looking to offer my services. And with the date next year, looming May 28th, GDPR. 25th, apologies, 25th. I would have given everyone 3 more days.
3 more days.
Not that it would necessarily matter. Seeing that, not so many are perhaps saying that they will absolutely be compliant. But what does this mean in the context of cloud service providers and GDPR?
Yeah, and one of the CIOs did predict that no one will be compliant with GDPR by that time frame. Right?
Well, we had anything between, I think, 0% and 20-25%, right?
Yeah, so the number is quite small.
Yeah, number small.
Yeah. So, I mean, we think GDPR is a good thing because it takes us into the new world, the digital world, in terms of protection of private data. It also creates a level of uniformity, which we need. But for cloud, there are some potential for cloud service providers. There are things to be aware of, right? And our prediction here is potentially quite controversial because we are saying that by 2020, a major cloud service provider will be sued for GDPR non-compliance, but not for a personal data breach. Because a lot of the focus at the moment is on the personal concerns about having a data breach and the notification around that data breach, which is reflected in some of our survey data here. But only 34% are concerned about class action lawsuits. Right. And a lot of people don't realize that only 4 of the 38 articles actually refer to data breach. So there's a lopsided or underestimation where there's an issue and overestimation where maybe there isn't an issue. And so for the cloud service provider, if you think about their connection to the subject and the fact that their supply chain risk increases as they head towards that subject, they're going to have to make major changes to the systems, the processes, and the people that are going to deliver on the contracts for their cloud services that they're delivering. Because if you look at some of the examples that have come through over the last 12 to 18 months, Morrison's, Max Schrems, that high profile, these are people taking service providers to court for certain issues, right? So that's what we need to be somewhat more aware of than data breaches and cloud service providers in particular. And so the implication here is for the chief procurement officer and the legal counsels, which is scrutinize those contracts with the cloud service providers, make sure that they are building in this risk as part of those contracts. And on the flip side of that, by the way, the cloud service providers might want to qualify who they work with in terms of delivering their services, because are they going to use their services in a GDPR compliant way?
Okay. So the first part of the story then, digital platform, followed by, or if you want, key elements of this being the compliant cloud. So we certainly look at that. So when we look towards the next section that we think is key going forward, that's that intelligent core. And that's really the second part of the story that hangs together. So the next few predictions are focused on that in particular. So do you want to talk a little bit more around how that relates particularly to AI as one of the key elements of this?
Sure. So I think AI obviously drives that intelligent core. I referred to that. So that really sits at the heart of the intelligent core. And our prediction here is that by 2020, 35% of European digital transformation initiatives will use AI services. Now, you might look at that and say that's a bit low, right? 35%. It is lower than the US and parts of China as well, even. So what's the reason for that? And because it reflects some of our survey data from the team. So Philip Carnelli, lead of our cognitive team, has run a survey on cognitive adoption, AI and cognitive adoption in Europe. And they found that only 9% of European organizations have an AI project in production, or maybe more than one AI project in production. And I think there is a concern. There's some issues around getting business buy-in to actually say, what are we going to do with this? And there's
so that's a business case.
A business case element. But increasingly, we also see this issue around AI ethics. Right? So concerns around privacy linked to GDPR to some extent, but much broader than that as well. I think some people on the webinar might see robots as a concern, right? Taking over, and I think everyone does share that concern. But it goes into bias, right? So if one of these algorithms starts to head towards providing a gender or race bias, how do you stop that from happening? And it starts to raise some important questions about society, but also context from a European standpoint. And I think that's why the European adoption of AI might be somewhat slower, but maybe potentially in a good way than other regions.
Yeah, and again, that's quite interesting, because we did see this certainly at the various summits that we have had over the last year, where there's been a lot of talk around those particular aspects and the announcements that we've seen recently from Google, for example, but also the sort of robots talking to each other in a language that perhaps we can't follow anymore as humans. There's probably some sensitivity in Europe in particular around some of those issues and what it might do to the workforce at large as well. Now, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's going to stop the train, right? Absolutely not. I mean, we see a big opportunity, particularly in terms of the combination of robotics and AI. And a really good example of this is Ocado in the UK, which is an online grocer. That is really providing a new type of, or developed a new technology, which was an AI-driven robotic solution for their warehouses, which is, it's a really cool technology, 3D pallet, where the robots are picking elements from the pallet based on the AI algorithm that's driving them. So no human intervention.
And this technology is so disruptive that they've then now been able to sell it to other retailers. So Morrison's, also just recently a big deal with Group Casino, which really shows how digital transformation with the technology investments can start to deliver some of these massive new revenue streams, which is what they've done.
And then that's you already mentioned it. So AI and robotics in combination, this is one of the other areas that we focused on.
Yeah, so we see some of these what we call innovation accelerators. So AI, robotics starting to come together and converge and deliver these business results, which was what we need, right? Because you can't have these standalone technologies operating in silos. And so we think that by 2021, over 40% of new industrial robots will leverage some form of AI. But so that's a big number. But we do think from a persona standpoint, this is probably most critical for HR. We think, coming back to the ethics discussion, we think that this new workforce of the future is going to have to look somewhat different, and HR is going to take a leadership role around the adoption, or how some of these technologies are adopted, and in the context of some of the labor laws that we have in Europe, but also ensuring that it's not just about replacing people, but augmenting tasks, and thinking about how we leverage the technology in a way that doesn't disrupt the workforce and people want to work in those environments.
Well, it certainly will mean a big change, I think, for us. And this is something that I think a lot of us are thinking about already. And I think one thing that stands out for me is, so we've got the intelligent core, we've got innovation accelerators like AI and robotics. And at the same time, the adoption perhaps partial in many ways. And this is also relates to another area which sort of feed as a feeding pipe, if you want. That's actually feeding the beast, if you want, right? So we're getting a lot of activity. But again, is it a similar story in terms of the adoption and versus the business case and the implementation that we're seeing?
No, I think with the next prediction, which is, as you say, very closely linked to AI, it's around IoT as a data pipeline into this intelligent core. So as we talked about, this infinity loop had these data pipeline or has these data pipelines coming in dynamically and using that data to recreate or redefine business processes, like the industrial robot use case we just talked about. And IoT is a critical data pipeline in this respect, given the growth of the connected devices that we're seeing. But we see it is a combination of IoT and AI. It's not IoT on its own. We think that if any organization implements IoT on its own, that without AI, it'll fail. So it'll have to be 100% of projects will have to have AI or analytics linked to the IoT. And then, by the way, ensuring that that's linked back to the business applications or the business processes. Because this is part of a business model transformation, right? So a lot of the organizations are looking at these data pipelines as a way of creating new services, new value-added data services. And some of our survey data from the IO team led by Andrea Sevillero and Marta Munoz shows that the number of organizations that are looking to use IoT for business model transformation, coming back to the future of commerce elements that I highlighted earlier, has more than quadrupled over the last 3 years. So it was single digits 3 years ago. Now we're looking at 25%. So that's the potential impact of IoT in terms of this digital platform story in a business context. But we think that the COO has to take ownership of this, because this is a business discussion. IT will play a role, but the COO needs to think about how to embed these data so these value-added services into the new service offerings with a air pump as a service or whatever new type of, or mobility as a service, data-driven type of services that are being rolled out by digitally transformed organizations.
Yeah, it's interesting, I guess, because we still come across a lot of examples that really just create data, but don't take that next step,
which is critical.
Which means that a lot of these projects actually fail, and we've seen this in the past as well. So we've had the compliant cloud. Now we're looking at these innovation accelerators around AI, robotics, as well as IoT as the pipe. Now, I guess we need a secure, intelligent core.
We do. Security is not an add-on, right? And I'm sure Duncan Brown and Dominic Trott, our security team, will be very happy to hear that security is part of the core. It has to be. But it comes back to our good friend Chema. We said we'd come back to him. And if you listen to him, not only is data the critical asset for Telefonica, but if it is going to be the basis for the new business model, it has to be secure, it has to be transparent, and it has to be private, right? So you have to maintain the trust. And that's inherent in the new thinking around this digital platform. It has to be a secure digital platform. in order for that to happen, the security capabilities coming from the market need to be much more integrated in nature. And we predict that by 2020, 60% of the security investments will be coming from vendors with an integrated platform security approach. This is reflected by some of our survey data, which shows that the primary driver for product selection is more about product rationalization.
Right.
This best-of-breed point product approach to endpoint security, DLP or vulnerability has to go away. It's about how you stitch them together. Because as one of the CISOs mentioned at the CISO Summit, the first question they'll ask is, how does your product integrate with my environment? So that they can reduce problems around skills, they can focus on ensuring that they can manage risk, and then also make sure that they are putting in place the right integrated platform to support their broader digital platform. Right. And that only comes if you put in place an integrated approach for that.
Now this will create challenges, right? I think all around, and this is probably one of the key aspects. One of the interesting questions actually we got at the CISO Summit is, at the moment, it doesn't seem to be much call for marketing this out. So if you're a very secure company, a very secure credit card company, is that a differentiator? Probably not quite yet, but we certainly think this is going to be core.
And the CISO of Daimler has indicated, and I think this is, he said the most popular car in the future will be the most secure.
Most secure car.
Because the connected car and that it has to be secure, right?
All right. So great. Thank you for that so far. So we've moved through compliant cloud, secure intelligent core, and now we're getting to the third episode. And we're going to look a little bit more at the edge and the experience level, as well as the interactivity, perhaps with other players in the connected system. I guess that's probably the best way of describing it. So, and I love the next slide that you're going to introduce in a second. So I'll hand over to you again.
Well, I think this is about the ecosystem, right? So this is about the ecosystem outside the organization. We've talked about how the company, any digital native enterprise, is going to have to react so dynamically to the ecosystem in a way that's quicker than their competitors. They have to be in touch with that ecosystem. And we think that the kingmakers and queenmakers of this ecosystem are the developers, and a very important set of stakeholders around the edges of the digital platform. Because they are going to be driving the development of these new hyper-agile apps, which are cloud-native and container-based in nature, which are delivering the new type of experience that we all want and love. So that's the one element. But they're also creating these new galaxies around cloud in particular. So around the new hyperscale mega platforms, as an example, the application, which application environments that they use, integration services from cloud, but also the industry cloud piece, right? So coming back to the industry cloud potentially link up between a BMW and a Siemens, the developers are potentially going to drive that way of thinking. So huge implications for the broader ecosystem if you can attract developers, either as an enterprise or a vendor, because they're going to drive the thinking.
So that's an interesting one. And with the next prediction, you're giving people like me a chance. So last time I programmed was Pascal, COBOL, somewhere in the 90s, early 90s. But, things might change.
Yes, exactly, because we also have this low-code or no-code type of environment for the new type of non-tech developers. For me, maybe you, I think you might be a bit ahead of me on that front. But these are the ones where you don't need to be technical. It's drag and drop, and you can create new types of capabilities very quickly in these low-code or no-code environments. And this it resonates very much for the CIO again, because they can create different relationships with digital and the business based on the new capabilities. If you can spin up these type of elements in a short space of time, as long as they're part of that digital platform, they're not separate as another island of innovation, right? So they need their alignment up front.
Yeah, although I could foresee some interesting conversations around who owns these kind of resources, right?
So business should own, IT enables. I think that's the story.
Good stuff. So we've got that first part. So the business is going to take a more active role. We're saying probably in the development of applications as well. But we also need to glue those together in a better fashion as part of the larger ecosystem. So you're going to talk a little bit about the open APIs. Yeah.
So I think if cloud is the underlying enabler for that digital platform, the enabler for the edges are the APIs. But from an internal standpoint, for the integration, as you talked about, but increasingly external. This is the next phase, the next wave of innovation, because companies are realizing that they need to open up significantly in terms of the data that they own, but also the new capabilities they're developing, those developers are creating, because they can monetize some of that. So we think there's an opportunity here. Some of it is regulatory driven. So if you look at a European specific regulation, PSD2, for banks in the payments space, they are having to do this in 2018. So this is driving a new way of dealing with fintechs, opening up their data, payments data to fintechs to then reuse for customers. And that's a different framework. And that leads to our recommendation here is to think differently in terms of the API. So this is a new mindset where you redraw the line as to what's secure, internal, and needs to be protected versus what do you open up to the ecosystem. And that's always going to be a balancing act, but it needs the right type of mindset. We think the Chief Digital Officer should be driving this, because they should be able to walk that tightrope to a certain extent.
Okay, so we have effectively new types of developers potentially. We have that integration layer with the external partners as well, or the external ecosystem. But then we're also going to get increasingly into a period now where we interact with technology, or technology enabled in a very different way.
So this is the new world of immersive interfaces, right? And I think this could be very exciting if it plays out the way we expect to play it. And this is not just AR and VR as we have it here, which is going to be driving this, but it's also voice. So we see a lot of focus on voice. And a lot of people are focusing on marketing as a set of stakeholders to drive these capabilities. But it's also potentially interesting from a training standpoint, or for even in warehouse picking.
Services.
So there are multiple use cases, right? Sure. But the key thing is here, there is a direct potential new revenue stream that could come, right? So we've got another important event coming up next year, which you might be watching, Tom, the World Cup in Russia. Now, you would have watched the World Cup in 1990.
I would have, as I said to you previously, I was about a couple of years old.
So Rudi Völler scoring that goal. Obviously, important win for Germany. I'm sure you're happy about that. But that was on one channel, and that was all FIFA got, right, for the rights for how that was broadcasted. Last World Cup 2014, more than 250 live streams. So that was the next phase. 2018 is going to be video on demand and virtual reality enabled. And so suddenly FIFA and their associated partners can provide you with a new type of experience linked to your best players and your best plays potentially, and you'll probably pay for it. And that's new revenue streams for them.
But it's also a gamification, I guess, of that consumer experience that plays a massive role at that particular point, right?
Absolutely.
So, I mean, that's certainly what we're seeing. So what does this mean in terms of the impact of...
So the CMO is the key stakeholder here. Even though we have those other use cases, I think what companies need to focus on is on the external ecosystem as a way of driving the thinking, because the thinking needs to change. It will come from mobility, but those web and mobile interfaces are going to decline in terms of relevance over the next 5 years. They will still be there, but I think increasingly the experience will be about VR, AR, and voice as the way of interfacing with the technology.
So far we've covered quite a few stakeholders and technologies, but part of the engagement system, if you want, or the ecosystem is obviously also something that we haven't mentioned yet that we probably should have mentioned.
Starts with a B.
Starts with a B, yeah, and ends with a chain that everyone has around our necks. So maybe just talk about what role blockchain plays in this particular context from our perspective.
Yeah, so I think the danger with blockchain at the moment is that it's the solution for every problem out there. It's going to solve world hunger. It's a whole range of different solutions if you listen to the media. We think we want to take a slightly more measured approach to this. I mean, we do think there's an opportunity. So we do think that a lot of organizations will test blockchain at department level. But by 2018, so end of next year, less than 10% will actually productize it. I mean, and this is reflected by our CIO Summit feedback, where, if you remember, 0% of
the blockchain breakfast that we had as well, right?
So very little traction there in terms of production examples. Now, there are some good use cases coming through. And this is a prototype, a proof of concept here in Europe, where a number of banks have come together specifically for trade transactions between SMEs. Now, SMEs, this is an interesting one, because SMEs, you might know, are and people on the webinar might know, that are underserved in terms of access to working capital because of risk. Right? Sure. So the banks don't want to take on the risk linked to that. So they often have to get from family or from friends. So that's the one issue that they face. The other one is that if they do manage to get a transaction through in terms of a trade agreement across country, then in some cases it takes 5 kilograms of paper couriered back and forth between the entities before that transaction is completed. So blockchain potentially plays a significant role here, first on reducing the risk in terms of creating that consensus algorithm and in the distributed immutable ledger where all the stakeholders can agree that this transaction has taken place and they affirm it. But also in terms of the automation, reducing that paper and having it in a digital format so that you basically are able to execute that transaction in a much more automated and trusted fashion. So that's a good example. And it reflects the fact that a lot of these initial use cases are in financial services, and we are seeing 1 in 4 European transaction banks, we're expecting that they will have blockchain networks in production by 2020. But it's not just financial services. It's also manufacturing, retail, looking at distributed digital identities in a supply chain, as an example. So we're seeing a lot of those type of use cases coming through.
And I guess, I mean, what we have seen, and you're reflecting that with this slide as well, is that at the moment, if you look even at some of the big automotive manufacturers, they've got maybe 1 or 2 use cases that they're exploring at this point, but that's going to change.
Yeah, I think there is an expectation that production environments will double by 2021, but that's 4 years out, right? So we've still got some time. I think there's a fair amount of concern around where to make a bet in terms of consortia, in terms of skills, and private versus hybrid type of blockchain environments. There are a few decision points that need to be made.
Okay, so that's great. So thank you, Phil. I think we're pretty much through this now. Let's just wrap it up perhaps by summarizing where we've been. We've had the main, if you want, the main prediction, and then we had 3 episodes around us.
Yeah, so we talked about the DX platform as a key way of looking at architecture to help organizations scale this journey and get them to the digital native enterprise by 2027. Focusing initially on the compliant cloud, then thinking about how you evolve that intelligent core in a secure fashion, but feeding it with data, like IoT as an example. And then the last chapter, which is all about the ecosystem and driving innovation in the ecosystem, because the digital native enterprise, it'll be about multiplying innovation in that time frame so that you can radically move the initiatives that you've got currently sitting in specific use cases to scale. Okay. And we also covered some other ground in terms of each of these predictions, which was the personas, right? And I think there was a key takeaway in terms of those personas, in terms of who we covered, right? If you looked at the people that we talked to, CEO, CISO, head of HR, CMO, I think there were only 2 examples of CIOs so it shows you 8 out of 10 more business type of focus in terms of
non-traditional tech roles potentially.
Exactly. Okay. Exactly.
Yeah. So let's maybe just talk about how this sort of pans out as we look into the future and how we look particularly at the use case journey. I think that's probably good to finish off with.
Yeah. So I think this is an important final step on the journey in terms of what to do next. Either if you're a vendor or an end user. Because this helps align the organization. So if you think about one of those CEOs at the beginning that we talked about, one of those 9 European-based CEOs, they've got to think about, okay, how does this look like over the next 3, 5, 10 years, and build out horizons, but with key use cases. Here's an example from retail. So maybe this is Ocado talking about intelligent fulfillment, and thinking about the use cases that map to intelligent fulfillment all the way to just-in-time production and Horizon 3. And what those use cases look like are not that important. It's more the fact that the company as a broader group is behind it and sees what the end game will look like. And I think that's important for those organizations that need to get to that digital native enterprise status in that 2027 timeframe to think it along those lines.
Okay, that's great. Phil, thank you very much. Take a quick breather. Maybe if you could go to the Q&A slide. And then what we'll do is we'll open up the lines. We've got many questions through. We have very little time left, so let me maybe just get to 1 or 2. And the first one is to Andrea. Hopefully, Andrea, we can hear you now.
I'm on the line.
Hi, Andrea.
Hey, Andrea.
Thank you for joining. So Andrea is one of the key analysts who've been driving the Brexit document as well. So the first question to you: is the Brexit-driven uncertainty impacting the European IT spending, and what are the initial referendum effects on the market? I guess this is a question of, do we expect more or worse to come?
Yeah, this is not actually an easy question, and what we are seeing at the moment is actually that the effect that we are seeing is more moderate than what we initially expected. And at the moment, we don't see any disruptive Brexit effect on the European IT market yet. Of course, we need to make some distinction between the services and software market that is quite stable when compared with the first half of last year, and the hardware one, where the hardware market, in particular for the UK market, we see that on one side there has been an increase in terms of price of devices, both driven by currency fluctuation, but also in general for, general market trend for the hardware sector. But then on the other side, we see a unit drop and uncertainty, in particular in the SMB sector. And then if we need to mention about vertical, probably we need to say absolutely that public sector, finance, and manufacturing are the three British sector more exposed to the first Brexit effects, and this is driven by relocation moves, currency fluctuation, as we said, and also waiting for new internal rules and relationship with the other countries. And while we see that instead for other sectors like utilities and other industries, telecom, media, transport, professional services, the impact is still very limited on that side.
Okay, great.
Yeah, that was just a very concise request. I would suggest to really download our Brexit document where you can see all this detail by tech and by vertical.
Mm-hmm. So that's great, Andrea. Thank you for that. And perhaps, as regards the previous slide. So first of all, we have a lot of questions on Brexit and the impact. So a lot more. So we'll keep answering.
The download is there for the Brexit. I would really recommend for the attendees to read that.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And perhaps one other thing I would just like to highlight. So Phil just showed the use case journey. We're obviously showing a lot of that in terms of the research that we're doing in terms of spending guides, where you see a good view of our perspective of how the money flows, particularly to those use cases and the timing of those use cases going forward. So that's certainly something you can follow up on.
And the scale, right?
And
so
the scale.
How big are those use cases so that you can think about investments associated with them?
Absolutely. So thank you, Andrea. One more very quick question perhaps to Duncan. Duncan, are you on the line?
Hello, Tom. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you. So Duncan, just a quick one. So we talked about cloud service providers and the impact of GDPR and the compliance question. Is the game going to turn around? Are CSPs going to be more selective and choose their customers on their GDPR compliance?
Well, with all things GDPR, you can't expect me to give a very short answer. It's very complicated. But I think the best guess is yes.
That's very good. So you're keeping it short.
So, and Duncan, maybe as a follow-up to that, maybe you could, because we focused a lot about cloud in the context of GDPR, and I think is it just about cloud? Maybe we can talk about some of the other technology areas that are going to be most affected by this looming date on the 25th of May.
Mm-hmm. I think it makes sense.
Yeah, it's basically everything. So there are key technologies, areas in information governance, for example, that are immediately affected. Obviously, security, storage, very important. But generally, just an understanding of an overall technology vision. One of the requirements relates to state of the art, and organizations need to come up with a view of what state of the art means, and whether that applies to them in terms of whether they need to implement it or not. Mm-hmm. So generally, there's an overall technology impact.
Okay. Great, thank you, Duncan. And I'm sure we can follow up on that as well. Maybe we can put the 10 myths of
the 10
GDPR.
Myths of GDPR. I'm sure we can distribute it.
Yeah, that would be good, I think. So let me just wrap up with a couple of comments around the next interaction points. We're obviously looking forward to interacting with you, and as a sponsor partner or as a delegate at one of our summits that we have up here as well. We've had a great series of summits last year. I'm sure we have a great series of summits again next year. And we're talking to a lot of different personas actually throughout those discussions. Yeah. And Phil already showed the download area as well.
Yeah, so I think this is follow-up background reading for all of you. As Tom said, we didn't get through all the questions. We were happy to follow up with those. But if there are questions on these downloads, then we can pick that up. The conversation continues.
Absolutely.
And
absolutely.
We really hope that the predictions that we put in place today give you some guidance, but also some ideas and inputs for 2018, but even beyond. That was the objective.
Yeah. And with that, I would like to thank you all very much. I would like to thank Phil and the analyst team in particular for putting all this together, putting in all the hard work and the hours, the stress, tears, pain, blood and sweat. So that's wonderful. Thank you for that. We'd like to hear your feedback. Get in touch with us, and hopefully you enjoyed this, and we'll talk to you soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.